I'm not usually the type to share these kinds of stories, but after what happened to me last month, I can't keep it to myself any longer. This was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life, and I still don't fully understand what happened. It was a little after midnight, and I was out with some friends at a bar in the city. The night had gone longer than expected, and I wasn't in the best state to drive, so I decided to call a cab to take me home. The streets were quiet, with only a few people milling about. I stood under a streetlight, checking the cab app on my phone, when a car pulled up beside me. The cab looked normal enough, an older model sedan with the usual company logo on the side. The driver rolled down the window and asked if I needed a ride. I was a bit surprised because I hadn't even booked a cab yet, but I figured maybe he was just driving around looking for fares. I nodded and got in. The driver was a man in his late 40s or early 50s with a friendly smile and a soft voice. He asked me for my destination, and I gave him my address. As we started driving, he made small talk, asking about my night, my plans for the weekend, the usual stuff. He seemed nice enough, and I started to relax a bit. But as we drove further, I noticed that we weren't taking the usual route to my place. The streets we were on were unfamiliar, winding through parts of the city I didn't recognize. I asked the driver if he was sure this was the right way, and he assured me that it was just a shortcut. I've taken cabs plenty of times and usually trust the drivers to know the best routes, but something felt off this time. As we continued, the conversation started to take a strange turn. The driver's questions became more personal, asking about my family, if I lived alone, if anyone was waiting for me at home. His tone was still friendly, but there was something in his voice that made me uneasy. I started giving vague answers, trying to steer the conversation back to safer topics, but he kept pressing. Then I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. The cab's meter wasn't running. I hadn't thought to check it earlier, but now it was glaringly obvious that something was wrong. I asked him why the meter wasn't on, trying to keep my voice steady, but he just laughed it off, saying that the ride was on him tonight. My heart started racing. I knew I needed to get out of that cab, but we were in the middle of nowhere. The buildings around us were old and abandoned, with no signs of life. I glanced at my phone, but there was no signal. Panic began to set in as I realized how isolated we were. I told the driver I wasn't feeling well and asked him to pull over. He didn't respond, just kept driving, his smile fading into a blank expression. I tried the door, but it wouldn't open. The locks were engaged, and there was no way out. Suddenly, the cab turned onto a narrow road that led into a dense forest on the outskirts of the city. The trees loomed overhead, blocking out the moonlight, and the road became rough and uneven. I was gripping the door handle so tightly that my knuckles turned white, praying for a way out. The driver finally stopped the car in the middle of the woods. He turned to me with that same unsettling smile and said, "This is your stop." I didn't wait to find out what he meant. I scrambled over the front seat and unlocked the passenger door, throwing myself out of the car. I hit the ground hard, but adrenaline kept me moving. I ran as fast as I could into the woods, not looking back. I could hear the driver calling after me, but I didn't stop. I ran through the trees, branches scratching my face and arms, until I reached a small clearing. I hid behind a large tree, trying to catch my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. After what felt like hours, I finally dared to peek out from behind the tree. The cab was gone, the road was empty, and there was no sign of the driver. I stumbled back through the woods until I found a main road where I flagged down a passing car. The driver was a kind woman who took one look at me and knew something was wrong. She drove me home without asking too many questions, and I was too shaken to explain. I reported the incident to the police, but they never found the cab or the driver. There was no record of any cab from that company picking up a fare in the area that night. I haven't taken a cab since then, and I probably never will again. Whatever that man's intentions were, I'm just grateful I got out when I did. I still have nightmares about that night, wondering what would have happened if I hadn't escaped. The woods, the driver's smile, the way the cab just disappeared. It all feels like a bad dream, but I know it was real. I can't explain what happened, but I know one thing for sure. Not all cab rides have a destination you want to reach. I'm not the kind of person who believes in ghosts or the supernatural. I've always thought there was a logical explanation for everything, but after what happened to me 2 weeks ago, I'm starting to question everything I thought I knew. It was a late Saturday night and I had just finished hanging out with some friends at a small gathering. The weather had taken a turn, with thick fog rolling in, making the streets of the town almost unrecognizable. I don't usually stay out late, but I'd lost track of time, and by the time I realized it, the last bus had already left. My only option was to call a cab. I pulled out my phone and requested a ride. Within minutes, a notification pinged on my screen. "Your driver has arrived." I looked around but didn't see any headlights approaching. Confused, I glanced back at my phone to check the car details. A black sedan, license plate ending in 327, but when I looked up again, there was nothing. The fog was so thick that I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. Suddenly, out of the mist, a black car appeared, gliding silently up to the curb. The license plate matched the one on my phone, but something about the car felt off. It was too quiet, too pristine, like it had just rolled off a showroom floor. I hesitated, but with no other options, and the fog making it impossible to see anything else, I opened the door and got in. The driver was a middle-aged woman with long, dark hair that obscured most of her face. She didn't greet me, just asked for my destination in a voice that was barely a whisper. I gave her my address, and she nodded slightly, then began to drive. As we started moving, I noticed that the interior of the car was eerily clean. There was no dust, no signs of wear, and the air inside felt stale, almost as if it hadn't been breathed in for a long time. The silence was unnerving, and the fog outside seemed to press against the windows, making it impossible to see where we were going. I tried to make small talk to break the tension, asking her how long she'd been driving for the company. She didn't answer, just kept her eyes on the road, her hands gripping the wheel tightly. The atmosphere in the car was suffocating, and I started to feel a growing sense of dread. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, and I began to realize that we were driving in circles. The same landmarks kept appearing out of the fog. A tree here, a stop sign there, always in the same order. I told the driver that she must be lost, but she didn't respond. Her grip on the wheel tightened, and she started to drive faster. Panic set in. I asked her to stop, demanded to be let out, but she ignored me completely. I reached for my phone to call for help, but the screen was dead, as if the battery had drained completely. The fog outside seemed to thicken, and the world outside the car became a swirling mass of grey. Suddenly, the car came to an abrupt halt. We were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by fog so dense that I couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. The driver slowly turned to face me, her hair parting just enough to reveal her eyes, cold, empty, and devoid of life. She stared at me for what felt like an eternity, and then, without a word, she unlocked the doors. I didn't wait for an explanation. I threw the door open and ran into the fog, the cold, damp air hitting my face like a wall. I ran blindly, my heart pounding in my chest, desperate to get away from that car, that driver. The fog was disorienting, and I stumbled over unseen roots and rocks, but I kept going until I couldn't run anymore. When I finally stopped, I realized I had no idea where I was. I was alone in the middle of the fog, with no landmarks, no sound, nothing but the dense mist surrounding me. I turned back, expecting to see the car's headlights through the fog, but there was nothing, just an endless grey void. I don't know how long I wandered in that fog, but eventually I stumbled upon a road. A passing car stopped, and the driver, a kind elderly man, offered to take me home. I was too shaken to say much, and he didn't press me for details. I just kept looking out the window, half expecting to see that black sedan following us. When I got home, I tried to report the incident, but the app showed no record of a ride being booked. There was no history of the car, the driver, nothing. It was as if the entire experience had been erased. I've since heard stories about strange occurrences in the fog, of people seeing things that shouldn't exist. But I never believed them, until now. I haven't taken a cab since that night, and I doubt I ever will again. Every time I see a thick fog rolling in, I can't help but remember those lifeless eyes, and wonder if the car is still out there, waiting for its next fare. This happened about a year ago, and I still can't shake the feeling that something was profoundly wrong that night. I live in a city where public transportation is unreliable at best, so like many people, I rely on cabs to get around when I don't feel like driving. It was a rainy Friday night and I had just finished a long shift at work. Exhausted, I decided to hail a cab rather than wait for the bus. The streets were slick with rain, and the neon lights of the city reflected off the puddles, creating a disorienting blend of colors. I flagged down a cab within minutes. The car pulled over, and I hopped in, grateful to be out of the rain. The driver was an older man, probably in his late 60s, with a greying beard and a cap pulled low over his eyes. He didn't say much, just asked me for my destination in a low, gravelly voice. I told him my address, and we set off. As we drove, I noticed something odd. The driver never made eye contact with me through the rearview mirror. Most cabbies do, if only to make sure everything's okay or to engage in some small talk. But this guy kept his eyes straight ahead, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. I figured he was just focused on driving in the rain, so I didn't think much of it at first. The ride was silent, except for the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers. The city streets were unusually empty, and the usual hum of traffic was absent. It felt like we were the only ones out on the road. I pulled out my phone to check the time and realized the driver was taking an unfamiliar route. I didn't recognize the streets we were on, and my usual commute was etched in my memory after years of the same drive. "Hey, I think you missed a turn," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. The driver didn't respond. He just kept driving, his face blank, eyes fixed on the road. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I repeated myself louder this time. Still, nothing. It was like he couldn't hear me, or worse, was ignoring me on purpose. Panic started to set in. I quickly opened the map app on my phone to see where we were. The screen showed a blank map, like the app couldn't even pinpoint our location. My heart began to race as I realized I had no idea where we were, and I was stuck in a cab with a driver who seemed intent on taking me somewhere I didn't want to go. I tried the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The locks were engaged, and there were no manual switches to unlock them from the inside. I was trapped. The rain outside intensified, pounding against the windows, drowning out the sound of my own breath. I looked up and noticed something that made my blood run cold. The meter wasn't running. The glowing numbers that track the fare were frozen, showing only zeros. That's when I knew something was very, very wrong. I began to shout, demanding to be let out, banging on the glass partition between us. The driver didn't react at all. It was as if I wasn't even there, as if I were invisible. The road outside became narrower and the city lights faded into darkness. We were heading into an unfamiliar part of town, an area I had never seen before. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the cab suddenly stopped. We were in a deserted, dark alley, the kind of place you only see in nightmares. The driver finally turned to face me. His eyes were empty, hollow, like he wasn't even alive. He stared at me for what felt like an eternity, and then without a word he reached for the door lock. The door clicked open and I bolted out of the cab, not even looking back. I ran down the alley, my footsteps echoing off the walls. I kept running until I reached a main street where I finally found another cab. I jumped in, breathless and trembling, barely able to tell the driver where to take me. As we sped away, I dared to look back at the alley. The cab was gone. It had vanished without a trace. I made it home safely, but I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The next day, I tried to report the incident, but there was no record of any cab matching the description I gave. It was as if the cab and the driver had never existed. To this day, I can't explain what happened. All I know is that I will never forget the look in that driver's eyes, and I'll never take a cab again, especially on a rainy night.